Class is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Developing Actionable Security Policies to Mobilize Your Workforce Against Cyber Attacks. I'm Kristen Zurvich and I'll be your moderator for today's webcast. But before I introduce our featured speaker, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping items. First of all, everyone is in listen-only mode, but we will be taking questions throughout the webcast, and I will share those with our speaker at the end. So I encourage you anytime during the webinar, simply go to the questions pane and submit your question. Like I said, I'll queue those up and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of our webcast. With that, I'd like to introduce today's featured speaker, Susan Morrow. Susan has worked in the IT security sector since the early 90s, providing research and consulting across different areas, including encryption, digital rights management, digital signing, privacy, and online identity. She has been involved in security projects addressing government, enterprise, and consumer needs, and has helped design and commercialize award-winning security software solutions that are used by organizations of all sizes around the world. She has patents pending for security software-related inventions and has published a number of papers on data security. Currently, Susan works as head of R&D at Avico Secure, who are specialists in online identity. Her mantra is that security is about human beings as much as it is about technology. And with that, I'd like to welcome Susan Morrow. Hi, Susan. You'll probably want to unmute yourself.
That does help. Thank you, Kristen, for introducing me there.
You're welcome. At this time, I'll switch control over to you and let you take it from here.
Okay.
And you should be all set.
Okay, let's tab through some of these slides and make a start. So before we make a start on the actual presentation, let's look at the agenda that I'm going to go through. So I'm going to set out the landscape, looking at some of the threats and the things that we have to counter on a day-by-day basis. And that will lay the foundation stone for getting executive buy-in. We'll talk about how best to do that, some of the strategies you can use to do that. Once we've laid that stone down, we can then look at your policy framework and the content of the policy, and then look at the actual implementation, rolling it out, getting everybody on board. That's probably one of the most difficult tasks of the lot. Once I've finished my piece, I'll then pass over back to Kristen, who'll talk to you about security awareness training and how that fits in with security policy creation and implementation. So, before we make a start, I'm going to ask Kristen if I can just move the slide forward to start with a quick poll about what is the biggest driver for creating a security policy in your organisation. It'd be really interesting to find that out, actually. So if you could fill in this poll, we'll leave it up for 10 seconds, Kristen.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I'm already seeing results coming in, which is fascinating. So thanks for everyone who's contributing, and we'll leave it open for another 3, 2, 1. So I'll share with you the results, Susan, which is actually quite nice to see. What we find is that there's actually 60% of the people that are attending today are saying that the biggest driver for creating a policy is both regulatory compliance and information security concerns. Of the remaining 40%, it's an even split between those that are just doing it for regulatory compliance reasons and the other part that are doing it for information security concerns. So it's actually quite refreshing to see that people have both of those issues or drivers on their mind as they're planning for their security policies.
Yeah, that's in some ways it's not surprising, actually. If we look at the next slide. This is not surprising in the context of the security landscape that we're seeing at the minute. In fact, I'm starting to think it's not really so much of a landscape, it's more of an ecosystem. And we're all drawn into it by cyber criminals who are treating our IT systems as the Wild West, as it were. If we look at identity theft, for example, which is one of my main areas of expertise, there's been a 40% increase in the theft of people's personal data in 2016, and it's year-on-year rise, and 1.1 million identities in the USA were exposed last year. Ransomware, everybody's biggest nightmare, is just going up and up and up, 36% increase in 2016. The WannaCry ransomware attack of earlier this year affected 400,000 systems across the globe, and just found out this week that a new potentially global threat in the form of Bad Rabbit has popped out of the magician's hat to come and frighten us all again. So watch out for that one. And of course, phishing, the cyber criminal's friend. Cyber criminals love phishing because it's really effective. It is the #1 way that malware gets embedded on desktops. And there's been a 71% increase in phishing incidents. And 3/4 of websites out there have got known vulnerabilities. So every single area that you look at, there are threats, and it's a big concern. And the ecosystem is unbalanced at the minute. It's unbalanced because the cyber criminals are getting the upper hand. We wouldn't see these sort of figures if that wasn't the case. So we need to do everything that we can in our power to prevent this. And we can go down the technology route, but one of the fundamental things that we need to start looking at is having a security policy in place so that we know how to address this imbalance. And a security policy is, it's a discipline. It's something that you have to just do, and it may seem daunting, especially if you're not working in security and you're not working in that area. It may seem daunting to bring everybody on board, but it's incredibly important in the kind of environment that we're working in at the minute to have something that you can turn to, and that gives people knowledge and understanding of what they're up against and gives them procedures to follow. Sorry about the slowness of the slides moving. Okay, and of course when they do move, they move too fast. So that landscape then feeds into the problems that we see. And the problems all have some financial components somewhere. Financial risk. Obviously, if you have a major cyber attack like the Equifax one that we saw a couple of weeks ago, your share price is going to be impacted because it's in the press everywhere. There was a 32% drop in Equifax's share price within a week of the breach. It's gone up a bit, but it's still not stabilized, and that is being seen right across the board. If you have a breach and it gets into the press, your share price will drop because it means that people lose faith in your company and think you've got problems. And that then is translated to your customers, and we're seeing reputational risk. In a study, 87% of individuals were less likely to do business with a company that had compromised their data, and that's totally understandable because you can't trust a company who doesn't put your data first, who doesn't look after your data. And of course, the big one that we all sort of lose sleep about at night is compliance. HIPAA, I've got an example of a HIPAA fine here, the biggest one to date, which was 5.5 million against Advocate Healthcare. However, other compliance, other regulations are coming in as well, like GDPR. GDPR, as we all know, their fines are through the roof. The top rate would be around 20 million euros or 4% of your gross revenue, whichever's the largest. It's pretty scary, but it's not an insurmountable problem if you know what you're doing and if you put steps in place to prevent these things happening. And of course, all these things, all these three risk areas are interlinked. You start addressing the problems in one of them, it will naturally follow that the other two will be addressed too. But you have to bear those in mind, because these are the areas as well that you can use as leverage to get people on your board and leadership teams behind you in implementing your policy when the time comes. Okay. No doubt when it goes to the next slide, it'll actually jump to several forward, but we shall wait. Right, so this is another poll here. And this is building on from what we've just talked about. So has your leadership team actually bought into the importance of an organisational security policy yet? Or do you have an education process to go through? So Kristen, I think we're going to have this for 10 seconds.
Yes, I just opened that poll. So if you could go ahead and respond to this question as well. I'm seeing plenty of results already coming in, which is great. And we'll just monitor that for another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And Susan, some interesting results here. I guess not maybe what I expected, but it's actually very nice to see. So with respect to has your leadership team already bought into the importance of an organizational security policy, 55% are saying yes, they fully support it. And then the balance are about 27% saying somewhat, but they still require a little bit of convincing. And then the remaining 18% are not yet. I'm here to learn how to communicate its importance.
Okay, right. Well then, those of you who have already got your C-level team on board, well done, because that's not easy. And those of you who haven't, hopefully the next few slides will help to give you some strategies and some reasons why it's really important to those people. And of course, security is a top-down approach. If you can get people at the top understanding the reasons behind security, they understand the reasons behind having a security policy and the reasons behind why you have to put certain measures in place, well then, you know, they can be your evangelists and they can help push that message out across the whole environment that you're working in. Right, so three sort of areas that you need to look at in getting your key executives on board. The first one is policy ownership and championship. So like I said, if you can get a top down, if you can get the top level behind you and they understand the importance, because it hits the bottom line of the company, because they're the ones who have to stand up in court if a class action is brought against the company because millions of people's data has been breached, then you know they're going to own that policy and they're going to get behind that policy and they're going to be your greatest advocate for that policy. So they can then push that culture that they are fostering down throughout the whole of the organization. One of the things that probably isn't obvious is that a lot of the people, especially sort of team leaders and the upper echelons of management, they have a deep knowledge of the departments that they've been working in. They've likely been working in that area for many years, if not decades. And they've got a great understanding of procedures and policies and working expectations, and they can feed that into your policy. They can tell you how best to align your policy with your business procedures, and get an alignment with your business procedures and your policy. Make sure that the policies that you pull out actually fit with how you do your business is half the battle, because you're not going to get pushback, because you're not going to get an employee turn around saying, well, that doesn't work in my company, that doesn't work in my department, because it will be aligned with what they do. And the third one is having a thorough understanding of information types. Of course, security today, it obviously covers many layers. Security covers many layers, but ultimately, one of the things that drives cybercrime is data, and understanding the different types of information that you gather and store and process and share, and how it's all done and who it impacts, can feed into your policy creation and understanding how relevant it is to the organisation and where to put potentially special measures in place. And again, this is where compliance, if you understand that, you'll be able to meet some of the compliance constraints of things like GDPR. So where do you start, of course? So it is, especially if you come into this where you haven't really done any of this before, it can seem a little bit daunting, a little bit, oh my God, where do I start? So the best place to start is to look at other people and the kind of advisories and guidance that's out there. And I've picked out 4 frameworks here. Now, these frameworks cover, I picked them out in particular because they cover the full gamut of IT systems. So from security through to, auditing and risk management and general sort of IT system control. And so the first one you can look at is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And that's a really useful framework that was put together over many years by, I think it was something like 200 organisations, all sizes and shapes and forms, who came together and said, look, we need to start to consider these things to have a framework to work from. And it has, I think it has 5 different areas that it asks you to look at in a sort of life cycle of security. And going from everything from assessment right through to protection. And it gives some examples and gives a lot of advice there. So it's good to have a look at that, have a work through it, and understand some of the key tenets of the framework. And one that some of you on the call may well have used, in fact, is ISO 27001, and that is that will give you some key measures that are typical of data protection expectations, and it's a standards-based, certified standards-based system. So you know that if you put these measures in place, then you're going to tick certainly some of the compliance boxes. So that's also a useful thing to have a look at. COVID 5, this is more about business processes and about audit, risk management, and so on and so forth. And it will give you a sort of an ability to be able to look at your processes and assign them levels of risk. And that's a really useful thing to understand. If you can compartmentalize your processes and your procedures in your company, you can start to understand where you need to put more effort in, or where you need to put certain types of measures in, or that sort of thing. It gives you a little bit more knowledge about what you're working with. And ITIL is a sort of library of advisories and guidances, which again you can pick and choose from that are relevant to your particular organisation and can help you get to the next level. But before we move on to the next slide, I picked out a particular saying from the ICCA where they said that what's an acceptable policy today may not be a satisfactory practice tomorrow. An important point that I want to make here is that security policies are not a static entity. They're dynamic. They change with changing environments. They change with technology. They change with new ways of doing things, new ways of working. Even things like remote working can come in and can impact on your security policy. So it's not something that you can do once and leave. You have to update it on a regular basis. Right, so once you've started to bring your C-level and your team leaders on board, and they all are behind you, once you've started to understand the reasons for doing this, and you understand where you need to make considerations in terms of your risk levels, in terms of the type of data you're using, just your general working environment, the type of technology you're using, you then need to start working towards drafting your framework. There's 3 areas that you need to make a start with, that you need to start jotting things down. This is the time when you need to start actually actioning in some of the things that you've done previously. So assessing your risks. We've talked about that a lot because it's very important. So it's a useful guidance. It's something that looks at enterprise risk management, and it has levels of risk, and it has examples of how to assign risk to different processes. But what I would say is use it as a guidance only. Don't mimic it. It's not necessarily right for your organization. Again, it's everything to do with security policies is about your organization, about your working practices, about how you specifically use data, how you specifically use technology, and so on. So everything's individualized, but COSA is a good place to start to get the risk management levels and understand where they can be applied to your organization. The next thing is to have a set of policy requirements. I'm a big fan of policy requirements because although you have to be careful not to constrain yourself too much with requirements, they're a great place to start. They're a great place to start listing what you need to have in there. I mean, they're great for everything. I'm a big fan, but security policies in particular, it's great because it's a discipline, and it allows you to set things down, and it allows you to focus your mind and focus the other people in your team's mind who are helping you to do this. And this is one area where you can really work as a team. And the third thing is the policy structure. Now, this again is very individual, and it depends on the size of your organization, the structure of your organization. That will be mimicked by your security policy structure. So once you have your draft, once you're ready, once you've got your requirements in place and you know what it is that you have to do, you can start looking at the actual content of the policy. Now, what I've got here on the slide is a list of content pieces, if you like. These are typical within a policy, but you might have additional content that is specific to your organization. But I'll go through each one so you can understand why I've put them in. So vision and scope. Okay, so that sounds really fluffy, but it's not. It's really, really important, because the vision and scope will be the thing that tells people why you're doing it and who it involves. And the thing about security policies is it's part of your security culture. Going back to this top-down information, drip of information to everybody within the corporation. Vision and scope is where you set out your goals and your values and your remit for this security policy. Regulation and compliance kind of goes without saying, but certain industries have certain regulations that apply only to them, and then there are coverall regulations that, depending on where you are in the world, in the US there's a mosaic of regulatory sort of expectations, but each industry will have to look at that in turn and weave that into the policy. Which brings me on to the next one, suppliers and business associates. So many regulatory frameworks now require that you make sure that your suppliers and business associates are aware of your policies, and some go as far as to say that you have to incorporate things like security training into your business associates and suppliers so that they understand what they can and can't do. So it's important to lay out who your suppliers and business associates are and what their expectations of them are in terms of policies that you're creating. Classification of data, we've already talked about that. It's really important, and this is where the discussions with departmental heads and people who are perhaps even on the board might want to have some input on that. Management goals. Again, these are the goals that that each department, each management, each team member wants to get to in terms of where the security policy imparts in their particular department or their organisation. Roles and responsibilities, very important section, because people need to know and understand what is expected of them. And certain, going back to compliance, certain frameworks like GDPR have very distinct and specified roles and responsibilities, and they have to do very distinct jobs. So these things, you can see all of these things are building upon each other and all interlinked. Incident handling, who's going to do what when do you have to? Have you got is there a window? Who do you have to communicate an incident to? When do you have to tell the customers? One of the big complaints made against Equifax was that, and other companies like Yahoo, was that they didn't tell customers for months, some even years, after an incident happened, and this has come back and haunted them. Review and reporting. So this goes back to the ISACA mention of a security policy being a dynamic entity. You have to have built into the security policy a regular review procedure. So, this may be once every 3 months. It depends on your organization, really. Let's say once every 3 months, once every 6 months. You need to review your policies, make sure they're still in line with the business and what you do as a company. And supporting documents and sub-policies, just that was put in there because many companies will have a sub-policy, maybe around authentication, maybe specifically around the authentication of access to sensitive resources, that sort of thing, and they'll have them as a sub-policy. And when reviewing and reporting, it's important to always look at those sub-policies because often they will incorporate new technologies as well, and you might have to update them and so on and so forth. So you've now got to the point where you've got your policy ready to go, ready to press the button. And the next step is, of course, implementation, getting there. So if you've done it, as I think it was 47% of our listeners have done already, they've already got support from leadership. That's where you start. You need to get them on board. If you don't have them on board, you're just going to have an uphill struggle all the time. But you should now have some strategies in place to be able to convince them that this is the best thing that they've seen. If they've got this, they've covered their back. So you need to get visible support from leadership, and that could be in the form of, communication across the organisation that this is going to happen, this is when it's going to happen, and how important this is. You need to demonstrate the alignment with business practices, though, because you won't get leadership involvement unless it aligns with business practices. And even if you do get leadership agreement, when you push that policy out, if the department head isn't happy because it doesn't fit with how they work, you're just going to have to firefight that policy from day one. Explain policy requirements and educate staff. Education is your friend when it comes to policies. People will push back just because they want to push back sometimes, but if you engage them, if you educate them, if they understand that this is about job security as much as anything else, that your policy means that your company will be protected, your customers will be protected, therefore your jobs will be secured, then you're much more likely for people to understand the point of the policy, and they will understand the requirements and being able to implement them on an individual level. And you have to have a zero level policy adherence. You must not infringe policies, because once you start infringing, it's a slippery slope, and it's really hard to get people back on board. And human beings like doing things like that. They like breaking rules. You've got to try and stop them. You've got to try and put measures in place whereby if people make policy infringements, they are taken to task on it. And again, I've said it before, I'm going to say it again, review and update regularly. This is not something that is set in stone from day one. It will change as you change, as your company changes, as staff changes, as technology changes. You need to keep all of those things in line with your security policy. So I think I've come to the end of my session, and I think I'm going to now pass that over to Kristen to follow on. Hi, Kristen.
Hi there. Thanks so much, Susan. I'm just going to advance your slides a bit. Thanks for a lot of great information. This has been really constructive. I'm hoping everyone's finding it useful in how they're thinking about their own policy development and implementation. As you've certainly heard, developing and implementing a security policy is one of the core components or cornerstones of developing a successful security awareness program. It really does help your employees understand the risks that your organization may face. It helps them learn about the regulatory security compliance requirements that are in front of either your industry or your institution. And probably most importantly, it helps them understand how that security policy applies to their day-to-day tasks. So at InfoSec Institute, we've developed Security IQ, which is really an integration of security awareness training, phishing simulations, and dedicated client support all in one platform. The goal is to help you drop your phishing susceptibility rates to 1% or even lower. And we do this by delivering real-world phishing templates. So there are over 100 templates that we provide in Security IQ. We engage your learners with realistic role-based training. And we provide time-saving automation for the delivery and the management of those courses to help folks like you use their time most wisely and most efficiently. So within Security IQ, there are two ways to actually educate your learners about your internal policies. One of them is a mandatory policy, and I'll walk through that just in a little bit. The other is to use a custom module. But the most common way is to essentially insert your mandatory policy within Security IQ for distribution to your learners. And it's quite simple. In Security IQ, you simply drop your policy into the text editor like you see here. It's really just uploading your policy for everyone to see. An alternative to that we find several clients do is actually to use the text editor as an opportunity to introduce their security awareness program first to employees. So a nice email kind of describing the goals, the purpose of the program, and then just including a link to the policy, which they then click and it opens separately. And that's what you're seeing on the screen in front of you. But either way, once you enable your policy in Security IQ, your enrolled learners will not be able to proceed with any training until they've actually acknowledged your policy. So when they receive a course reminder like the one on the screen and click a link in that to access their training, they will first see your policy message come up. They'll be prompted to acknowledge that. And the nice thing about it is their action is actually logged in their learner timeline for reporting purposes. So you have that then as a record of entry. Once they agree, of course, then their course module will appear and they can proceed as normal with their security awareness training. One other added benefit to Security IQ is, as I mentioned, we have built-in training modules within the platform, and most of our modules also reference internal policies. So it provides the opportunity to reinforce the importance of that policy and your policy specifically in any of your security awareness training. So that's actually how simple it is to use a platform like Security IQ to distribute your security policy. But I do encourage you, if you are interested in actually giving Security IQ a try for yourself, you can go to securityiq.infosecinstitute.com and you can get your own free account to test not just the security policy distribution, but the phishing simulation. You can test the awareness training modules and so forth. So go ahead and take a look at that. And in the meantime, I'm going to jump back, Susan, to the questions that have been coming in through the course of this webinar.
Okay, hi.
So are you ready? We've got quite a few here, and I know just looking at the time that I have, we won't be able to get to all of them. And if we don't get to your question, I do apologize, but we will respond to you directly. But let's get started. There are several questions in the queue that are around the same theme, so I'm going to just summarize it. The gist of it is that once I have a policy, what kind of time frame should I be thinking about for reviewing and updating that policy? And specifically, are there any things that I should be on the lookout for that would prompt me to actually update my policy?
Yeah. Okay, so it kind of is on a sort of, I can only give some sort of guidance because it is on an individual basis and different companies have, different drivers. But certainly, if you have any new technology that you take on board, or if you start processing data in a different way, or if you have any significant changes in terms of staffing, or addition, for example, if your company buys in another company, or merges with another company, triggers like that, obvious triggers like that, should trigger a review of your policy. You might not need to make any changes, but you need to just double check it. You can set in place, so they would be ad hoc. You can set in place regular ones anyway, just as a sort of, you know, a sort of exercise to make sure that you're on top of things. I mean, I wouldn't do them any less than about, in this environment, once every 6 months, because it changes so quickly. I know a lot of companies are expanding into, especially with the supply chain, into the IoT. And so you really do need to, if you've got a security policy now and you haven't updated it recently, I would look at it, because a lot of your supply chain members might actually be using this type of technology, and you really do need to have a look at the privacy issues and security issues around that. So I don't know if that really answers it. It's a combination of ad hoc when you have any major changes in your company, mixed with a regular, you know, at least 6 monthly, if not more regular, policy review.
Very good. Yeah, that is helpful. I do have a question from Laura. She's asking, can I or do I need to involve employees in the process of creating my policy? Is there any benefit to that?
Again, it depends on the company. I mean, a small company, you know, that isn't a problem. But in a larger company, obviously, logistically, that might be very difficult. I would certainly wouldn't do it early on. If I was going to do it, I would do it later on. And I would do it in line with, if you're going to do some security training, you should, out of that, depending on the tool that you use, you should get some metrics out of that. And that will give you some good feedback without actually engaging them directly, but engaging employees directly. You would get good feedback, and that might actually be able to inform you about some areas where you've got some problems. So there's a lot of feedback, excuse me, sort of from those sorts of tools. It really does depend on your relationship with your employees. If you can, do so, but do it in a very formal manner, because you could actually combine the two things together. You could combine making them aware of security with the importance of a security policy, and get feedback in that session that you can then feed into the security policy. That's how I would do it anyway.
Good advice. Thank you. I do have another question here, and again, I'm summarizing from a variety of questions that are coming in there along the same vein. But what several folks are asking are, based on your experience, can you share some specific tactics that you've seen work on how to get top-level executive or management teams to buy into a security policy?
You mean, apart from telling them that it's their butt on the line? Yeah, sure. I mean, fortunately, the cyber criminals are kind of doing that for us, by making such massive high-profile cases get into the news. I mean, they really are doing a great. Thank you, cyber criminals. Thank you for that. They are, you know, getting it out there. It's hardly a day goes by without some C-level executive being hauled through the courts. And you know, there was a recent case where the CEO was sacked in an Austrian company who are part of the supply chain in airline parts, and he was sacked because there was a whaling event that happened in his company, and 40 million euros was stolen, and he got sacked. CEO was sacked. And then there were other cases where CEOs have been taken to court as part of a class action. So those are the FUD things, you know, the fear, uncertainty, doubt that you can use against, you know, but you know, the bottom line is that this is their company. You know, this is something that affects everyone right across the company. It affects everyone. It's job security. It affects the job security of everyone, the CEO down. That should be enough of a driver to get them to sit up and take notice in the boardroom.
A very good point. I do have a question here from Henry, which is a good one, actually. And he asks, must security strategies and policies always come before actually implementing security controls? Where tactical security controls are already deployed by an operations team without policies, how would you go about addressing this?
Chicken and egg, the old chicken and egg. Yes, I'm trying to think of an example in my actual real life. Yes, we've actually, I can't obviously mention any names or anything, but I've actually been in that situation where a particular piece of, it was actually an audit, it was actually a security audit, had been put in place, and it was doing its job, but there wasn't a policy around it. And what happened was we had an enormous number of logs suddenly generated, an enormous number, which looked like the system was being hacked. We didn't have a policy in place to know how to deal with it. And what resulted was a lot of people running around screaming, and what the hell's going on? What can we do? What can we do? I mean, obviously, eventually we sorted it out, and it wasn't actually a hack. It was a mistake. It was a mistake in the way that the audit was being generated. But because we didn't have a policy in place at that time, we spent about 3 days, I think it was, analysing these logs and bringing everybody, people who should have been doing better things, more important things, together to try and analyse these logs across 2 continents. And in the end, we sorted it out. But if we'd had a security policy in place, we could have followed a procedure. We could have, well, actually, I don't think it would have happened in the first place. Although we had put these audit logs in place to catch security potential hacks, they weren't being used correctly. If we'd had a policy in place, we probably would have followed that procedure to put them in place, and they would have worked a lot better and would have saved us 3 days. Several people saved.
Very good.
That's my opinion.
Yeah, unfortunate.
If you've already got them in place, you can do retrospective policies around them. You know, you can align your policy to them, and you can improve them. Don't do what I did.
Yeah, it's nice to have some personal experience there that you can share with the group. I do have a question here from Marshall, which is a little bit more tactical and specific, but I think a good one. And he asks, what is a good policy for employees accessing personal emails? Is it common for companies to block all access to emails beside the company emails?
Some companies do. So in sort of government sector, they will do that. You won't be allowed to access personal emails. Some companies allow it. The problem is, by allowing personal email access, you do potentially open up security holes. That's up to you if you want to do that. I mean, a lot of people bring in their own devices now anyway to access personal. I mean, you could have a policy in place that says you can access private emails, but from a personal device that is not in any way attached to the the corporate network. I personally wouldn't like employees in a large corporation to be able to have access to private emails because of the potential of phishing and the potential of malware. It's really down to you, but I wouldn't do it.
Good. I'm just looking at the time. We are coming up at the end of our webinar time, so being cognizant of everyone's schedules today, I do want to keep us on time. But I'll close with this one final question, which I can answer for Brittany and a couple others that have asked. The question was whether the slides for this presentation today will be available. And yes, they will. After this webcast, we will actually be making a link of the recording, which will include the slides and the whole audio track for you. All of the attendees on this webcast will receive that link via an email, if not today, tomorrow. And then we will also post the slides online if you want to go there and get them. But do watch your email and look for a link to this webcast, which you can either rewatch or you can forward the link on to colleagues who you think might benefit from it. But with that, Susan, I do thank you today for all of your expertise and your time. It's been a wonderful webcast. I'm sure folks have learned a lot, and hope to do this again sometime. So
okay,
thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody. Thank you. Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.